Morning fog wrapped around the English airfield at Ryden like a gray blanket. Captain Klaus Fischer tugged at his worn leather jacket. The intelligence papers lay scattered before him on the wooden briefing table. March 10, 1943, had arrived with promise. This veteran Luftwaffe pilot had good reason for his confidence. Nearly 4 years had passed since his Messerschmitt Bf-109 first took control of European airspace. Allied bombers became burning wreckage under his guns. American fighters fell like autumn leaves whenever they dared challenge him. His machine had proven superior to every enemy aircraft that crossed his path. The Spitfire could turn and twist through the sky, but its fuel tanks ran dry too quickly. The P-38 Lightning boasted impressive speed through twin engines, yet its complexity created endless mechanical problems. Now, these intelligence reports spoke of something called a P-47 Thunderbolt. Fischer studied the specifications with growing amusement. 8 tons when fully loaded. A radial engine bigger than most automobile motors. Wings so incredibly thick a man might crawl through their interior spaces. The whole design seemed like some engineering joke played on the Americans. Fischer turned toward his wingman Hans Miller with a wide grin. "These Americans are sending us a flying bathtub. This war becomes easier with each passing day." Fischer had no way of knowing the truth. 14 of these supposed flying bathtubs were already clawing their way up through England's grey morning sky. Their enormous Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engines roared with devastating power. Each motor produced 2,100 horsepower of raw mechanical fury. Inside one Thunderbolt cockpit, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson wrapped his fingers around the control stick. His knuckles showed white through the leather gloves. Nervous energy coursed through his 22-year-old frame. Flight instructors had written Johnson off months earlier. His gunnery scores barely met minimum requirements. His shooting skills seemed hopeless during training exercises. Even his own squadron commander harbored serious doubts. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke privately wondered if this young pilot would survive his first real combat encounter. The battle-hardened Luftwaffe would test every weakness. Every hesitation could mean death. But Johnson's massive fighter carried something no German pilot had ever faced before. 8 50-caliber machine guns waited in those thick wings. Together, they could unleash over 3,000 rounds per minute of devastating firepower. When those guns spoke in unison, they sent streams of half-inch bullets through the air. These projectiles could tear aircraft apart in mere seconds. The challenge lay in getting close enough to use this incredible armament effectively. This is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt's remarkable journey from dismissed failure to feared fighter-bomber. Engineering audacity created this aerial monster. Tactical evolution transformed its apparent weaknesses into deadly strengths. Pilots learned to harness its unique capabilities against experienced enemies. Above all else, 8 50-caliber machine guns would reshape the balance of power across European skies. The year 1939 brought sobering reality to American aircraft designers. Germany's war machine had crushed Poland with frightening efficiency. American fighters looked pathetically outdated compared to the latest German designs. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 climbed faster and flew higher than anything in American service. Its hitting power exceeded every fighter the United States possessed. Change had to come quickly. Change had to come dramatically. The responsibility fell upon Alexander Kartveli's shoulders. This Georgian immigrant had fled Bolshevik persecution to find refuge in America. His aircraft design genius would help determine the outcome of civilization's greatest conflict. Military officials demanded impossible specifications. They wanted more speed than existing fighters. They wanted heavier armor protection than current designs. They wanted devastating firepower beyond anything previously mounted. Kartveli pulled out his sketch pad during a train ride home from Washington meetings. Most fighter aircraft of that era prioritized nimble agility over raw power. Engineers built them light and maneuverable for twisting dogfight encounters. Conventional wisdom guided every design decision. Kartveli threw all conventional wisdom directly out the window. The military wanted more of everything. He would deliver more of everything, even if it meant creating the largest, heaviest, single-engine fighter aircraft anyone had ever conceived. The massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp formed the heart of his revolutionary design. This 18-cylinder radial power plant displaced over 2,800 cubic inches of internal volume. It generated more horsepower than the engines powering most battle tanks. Harnessing this incredible power at high altitude required an elaborate turbo-supercharger system. Pressurized air forced into the engine maintained full power output even at 3,000 feet altitude. The turbo-supercharger system created unique engineering challenges. Enormous ducts had to channel exhaust gases from engine to turbocharger. The turbocharger sat deep in the aircraft's belly section. Compressed air then flowed back to the engine through additional ducting. These massive ducts gave the P-47 its distinctive deep fuselage shape. The barrel-shaped appearance earned nicknames from pilots who called it the Jug. But the armament system truly separated the Thunderbolt from every other fighter design. Most American fighters carried 650 caliber machine guns as standard armament. Kartveli's design mounted 4 guns in each wing bay. Staggered positioning allowed optimal ammunition feeding from multiple sources. Each gun could fire 750 rounds per minute independently. Combined firepower reached devastating levels. Together, all 8 guns could place 100 rounds per second into any target. The celebrated P-51 Mustang carried only 6 guns for comparison purposes. Its total ammunition load reached just 1,800 rounds, maximum. The Thunderbolt packed 3,400 rounds of mixed ammunition types. Pilots had enough firepower for 30 seconds of continuous shooting. The first XP-47B prototype lifted off on May 6, 1941. Test pilot Larry Brabham found himself wrestling with an aircraft unlike anything he had ever experienced. Empty weight reached 900 pounds without fuel or ammunition. This represented a 65% increase over its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The landing gear required special telescoping mechanisms. During extension, the gear stretched outward 9 additional inches. This provided necessary clearance for the enormous 13-foot propeller diameter. Kartveli himself acknowledged his creation resembled a prehistoric dinosaur, but he added with characteristic confidence that it would be a dinosaur with perfect proportions. Early test flights revealed both incredible promise and serious problems. The P-47 could achieve speeds that left other fighters struggling far behind. At high altitude, its turbocharged engine provided almost magical performance advantages, but enormous weight made tight maneuvering extremely challenging. System complexity meant multiple potential failure points during combat operations. The aircraft's immense mass fought against quick directional changes. Its sophisticated systems demanded constant attention and respect from pilots. Any mistake in managing the complex controls could prove fatal in combat situations. As 1942 dawned with America's entry into global warfare, production P-47s began rolling off Republic Aviation's assembly lines. Initial military orders called for just over 200 aircraft delivery, but planners already understood they would need thousands more. The critical question remained whether American pilots could master this aerial giant. German aces were waiting to shoot down anyone who failed to learn quickly enough. The 56th Fighter Group became the Thunderbolt's crucial proving ground. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the unit with veteran insight. He had flown with the Royal Air Force during Britain's desperate battle for survival. His experience provided clear understanding of what his pilots would face over occupied Europe. Training results deeply concerned this experienced commander. The Thunderbolt differed dramatically from every fighter his pilots had previously flown. Its massive size and weight proved unforgiving of piloting errors. System complexity baffled pilots accustomed to simpler aircraft designs. During the extended training period, 18 pilots died in accidents. 41 aircraft were lost to non-combat causes. Some pilots struggled desperately to adapt to the aircraft's unusual size and handling characteristics. Others found the turbo supercharger system completely bewildering. A few simply could not handle the responsibility of managing 8 heavy machine guns simultaneously. But Zemke possessed the tactical innovation skills to recognize hidden opportunities. The Thunderbolt's apparent weaknesses could become devastating strengths in properly trained hands. Unlike nimble fighters that relied on tight turns and quick maneuvers, the P-47 was fundamentally built for speed and overwhelming power. Its massive engine and heavy construction created incredible diving speed capabilities. Thick wings and robust fuselage construction could absorb tremendous battle damage while continuing to fight effectively. Those 8 machine guns could obliterate any target they managed to hit accurately. Zemke developed revolutionary tactics that played directly to these unique strengths. His pilots would avoid traditional turning fights with German fighters completely. Instead, they would use altitude and speed advantages for maximum tactical benefit. High positioning above enemy formations provided ideal attack opportunities. Diving attacks maximized their speed and firepower advantages while minimizing exposure to return fire. After completing their attack runs, superior diving speed allowed escape opportunities. Climbing back to altitude set up additional attack passes against the same targets. This became known as boom and zoom tactics throughout the fighter community. These tactics would revolutionize air combat across European skies. But first, Zemke's pilots had to prove the concept against experienced Luftwaffe veterans in actual combat conditions. On January 3, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group boarded the massive HMS Queen Elizabeth for Atlantic crossing. The ship's cargo holds were crammed with crated P-47 aircraft. Spare parts filled additional storage spaces. Ammunition boxes occupied every available corner. As the enormous liner cut through gray Atlantic swells, pilots studied technical manuals intensively. Recognition drills occupied hours of each day. Everyone wondered what reception awaited them in European skies. They would not have to wait long for answers to their questions. By early March, the group had established operations at English bases. Reassembling aircraft from shipping crates required enormous effort. Preparing for combat operations demanded constant work. Mechanical challenges proved immense and time-consuming. Many P-47s arrived with serious engine problems that grounded them immediately. Faulty radio equipment plagued communication systems. Turbo supercharger issues had to be resolved before aircraft could fly combat missions safely. Republic Aviation had rushed the Thunderbolt into production to meet urgent military demands. Early production models suffered from numerous teething problems that had not been resolved. Engines failed due to ignition breakdown throughout the electrical systems. Distributor leakage caused power losses at critical moments. Turbo superchargers malfunctioned at high altitude when they were most needed. Radio equipment proved unreliable in the electromagnetic environment surrounding combat operations. Ground crews worked around the clock to get these massive fighters ready for war. Meanwhile, German intelligence was taking careful note of the new American arrivals. Luftwaffe pilots had grown comfortable engaging Spitfires in combat. They respected these aircraft, but understood their capabilities and limitations completely. The P-38 Lightning had posed some tactical challenges with its twin-engine configuration. Heavy armament made it dangerous in head-on attacks, but German pilots had developed effective tactics against Lightning formations over months of combat experience. This new aircraft represented something entirely different from previous encounters. Reports filtered back to Luftwaffe headquarters describing an enormous single-engine fighter. Its firepower seemed unprecedented for aircraft of this type. Some German pilots dismissed these initial reports as gross exaggerations from inexperienced observers. Others took the intelligence more seriously. Veterans who had survived encounters with American heavy bombers understood devastating defensive armament capabilities. If Americans could concentrate that kind of firepower into a single-engine fighter design, everything would change dramatically. The morning of March 10, 1943, dawned gray and heavily overcast across English airfields. At Horsham St. Faith, pilots of the 4th Fighter Group gathered for their standard morning briefing session. Today would mark the combat debut of the P-47 Thunderbolt in European skies. 14 of these massive fighters would conduct an offensive sweep over northern France. 12 Spitfire Mickey Verses remained with the group for this historic mission. Second Lieutenant Bob Johnson sat quietly in the briefing room. His stomach tightened with nervous energy that he tried to control. At 22 years old, he was among the younger pilots in the squadron. Poor gunnery school performance had marked him as a potential liability in combat situations. But Johnson had spent countless months learning every detail of his assigned aircraft. He studied its systems until he could operate them purely by instinct. Understanding came through repetition and dedication. In the Thunderbolt, survival depended completely on using the aircraft's strengths properly. Avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses was equally critical. As the briefing concluded, pilots walked slowly toward their waiting aircraft. Johnson ran through his mental checklist one final time. 8 50-caliber machine guns waited in the wings. Each gun was loaded with 425 rounds of mixed armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition. Total ammunition load reached 3,400 rounds of devastating firepower. Combined rate of fire exceeded 3,000 rounds per minute when all guns fired simultaneously. This represented enough firepower to tear apart any aircraft in the German inventory. The challenge remained getting close enough to use it effectively against experienced opponents. Ground crew members helped Johnson strap into his cockpit properly. They guided him carefully onto the runway for takeoff procedures. The P-47's massive nose completely blocked forward visibility during taxi operations. Careful coordination between pilot and ground crew was absolutely essential for safety. As Johnson lined up for takeoff, he felt the enormous power of the double Wasp engine vibrating through the entire airframe. This moment had finally arrived. After months of intensive training and preparation, the Thunderbolt was finally going to war against the best pilots Germany possessed. The formation climbed slowly through heavy overcast conditions. They emerged into brilliant sunshine above the thick cloud layer. Below them, the English Channel stretched endlessly to the horizon. March winds whipped its surface into white-capped swells that rolled constantly. Ahead lay the coast of France, and unknown reception from the Luftwaffe. Johnson's radio crackled with routine communication as the formation settled into cruise configuration. The Spitfires, being lighter and more nimble aircraft, had to reduce throttle settings to stay with the heavier Thunderbolts. For P-47 pilots, This first mission served multiple purposes beyond engaging enemy aircraft. Learning to operate their aircraft in actual combat environment was equally important. As they crossed the French coast, ground-based radar stations began tracking their approach carefully. In operations rooms scattered across occupied France, Luftwaffe controllers plotted the incoming formation on situation boards. Fighter squadrons received alerts to prepare for immediate interception missions. The stage was perfectly set for the first confrontation between Thunderbolts and fighters that had dominated European skies for over 3 years. But German reaction proved completely unexpected to the American pilots. Instead of rushing to intercept this new threat, Luftwaffe controllers held back their fighters. Uncertainty about how to respond to this unfamiliar aircraft type created hesitation. The P-47 appeared larger than any single-engine fighter they had previously encountered. Yet, it was operating at altitudes and speeds that suggested formidable performance capabilities. The sweep continued without any combat incidents whatsoever. The mixed formation of Thunderbolts and Spitfires crisscrossed the skies over northern France unopposed. German fighters remained at their bases throughout the mission. Americans completed their assigned mission without firing a single shot in anger. It proved an anticlimactic debut for the most heavily armed fighter aircraft in the world. But the lack of combat on that first mission was completely deceiving about future encounters. Luftwaffe intelligence officers were analyzing every available scrap of information about this new American fighter. They were trying desperately to understand its true capabilities. Developing effective countertactics became their highest priority concern. What they discovered in the following weeks would force them to completely revise their assessment of American air power potential. The P-47 was not simply another fighter aircraft joining the war. It was a flying weapons platform that combined unprecedented firepower with extraordinary damage absorption capabilities. Its 850 caliber machine guns could destroy enemy aircraft with brief bursts that left little chance for pilot survival. The massive radial engine could continue running even after taking hits that would disable liquid-cooled power plants completely. Heavy construction allowed diving speeds faster than any fighter in German service. Within days of that first uneventful mission, the Thunderbolt began demonstrating these capabilities in deadly earnest combat. On March 28th, P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group encountered German fighters for the first time in actual combat conditions. The engagement lasted only minutes, but its outcome was completely decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Zemke's tactical innovations proved their worth, as his pilots used altitude and speed advantages to devastating effect against experienced opponents. The sound that became forever synonymous with P-47 combat operations was unlike anything previously heard in aerial warfare. When all 8 machine guns fired simultaneously, they created a distinctive buzzing roar. This terrifying sound could be heard for miles across the battlefield. German pilots who survived these encounters described the psychological impact of that unique sound. They knew that each burst contained enough firepower to tear their aircraft completely apart. What made the P-47's armament so devastatingly effective was not simply the number of guns mounted. Their precise arrangement and enormous ammunition load created the real advantage. 4 guns in each wing were staggered to allow optimal ammunition feeding from side-by-side ammunition boxes. This configuration provided exceptional reliability in combat conditions. Jamming problems that plagued other heavily armed fighters were virtually eliminated. With 3,400 rounds available, pilots could engage multiple targets during single missions. Sustained long bursts against heavily defended positions became tactically feasible. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was itself a formidable weapon system. Originally designed for ground-based use, It fired bullets weighing nearly 2 ounces each. Muzzle velocities approached 3,000 feet per second, with armor-piercing rounds. These projectiles could penetrate aircraft armor plating easily. They could destroy engines with single hits. Fuel tanks burst into flames from their incendiary components. When 8 of these weapons fired together, the result was complete devastation. German pilots quickly learned to respect the Thunderbolt's incredible firepower potential, but many seriously underestimated its other combat capabilities. The aircraft's massive size and tremendous weight suggested a sluggish performer. Logic indicated it could be easily outmaneuvered by lighter, more nimble fighters. This assumption proved fatal for many experienced Luftwaffe pilots. They discovered too late that the P-47 could dive faster than anything in their entire inventory. The secret lay in exceptional power-to-weight ratio at high speeds. While the Thunderbolt was indeed extremely heavy, its enormous engine generated enough thrust to accelerate the aircraft to extraordinary speeds during diving attacks. German fighters attempting to escape by diving found themselves overtaken by pursuing Thunderbolts. Superior speed allowed American pilots to position themselves for devastating gun attacks. By summer 1943, the P-47 had established itself as a formidable air-to-air fighter throughout European combat zones. But it was about to undergo another transformation that would make it even more feared by German ground forces. Allied commanders were beginning to recognize the Thunderbolt's unique combination of firepower, armor protection, and structural durability. These characteristics made it ideally suited for roles that went far beyond traditional fighter combat missions. The heavy bomber offensive against Germany was reaching its absolute crescendo of destruction. But bombers alone could not win this war completely. Allied forces needed the ability to attack ground targets with precision and devastating effectiveness. They needed aircraft that could carry bombs and rockets while fighting through enemy defenses. They needed true fighter bombers for battlefield support. The P-47 Thunderbolt was about to prove it was perfectly designed for exactly that critical mission. As 1943 drew toward its close, German pilots were already reporting disturbing encounters with these massive American fighters. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most experienced and successful pilots, would later observe that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of battle damage. It had to be handled very carefully in combat. One mistake against a Thunderbolt pilot could prove fatal. This reluctant acknowledgement came from an ace who had destroyed more than 200 enemy planes. He was admitting something troubling. The Americans had unleashed a fighter completely different from anything seen before. Yet this revelation was nothing compared to what would follow. The Thunderbolt was ready to prove something shocking. Those 850 caliber guns were merely the opening act of its destructive potential. Once loaded with explosives and rockets, it would transform into a weapon of surgical precision. German formations would crumble beneath its assault, whether airborne or earthbound. The metamorphosis began on a crisp April dawn in 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson found himself isolated at 27,000 feet. 15 German fighters circled him like predators. His P-47 had lost contact with his formation during fierce fighting above the Dutch coastline. The confusion of battle had separated him from his wingmen. Now, this young aviator faced his moment of truth. He had barely scraped through gunnery training. His instructors had questioned his shooting skills. Yet, here he was, about to test everything his massive aircraft could deliver. Johnson kept his hands calm on the flight controls. The first Focke-Wulf 190 plunged toward him with cannons spitting fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the German cockpit. The enemy pilot had calculated poorly. He assumed the bulky American fighter would struggle in close maneuvering combat. Tight turns and quick reversals should favor his lighter machine. Instead, Johnson shoved his Thunderbolt into a vertical dive. He used every pound of its enormous weight. The powerful engine screamed as it accelerated beyond anything the German could achieve. The Focke-Wulf pilot refused to abandon his quarry. He followed Johnson downward into the dive. This was precisely what the American had anticipated. At 400 miles per hour and still gaining speed, Johnson reversed his dive. He hauled back hard on the control stick. His superior energy state carried him upward in a climbing zoom. The German pilot found himself trapped in the worst tactical position possible. He sat below and behind an aircraft bristling with 850 caliber machine guns. His lighter fighter could not match the Thunderbolt's energy retention. Johnson's opening burst lasted under 2 seconds. Those brief moments proved decisive. 34 rounds of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition hammered the Focke-Wulf. They struck across the wing root and central fuselage. The German fighter bucked and shuddered under the impacts. Metal fragments sparkled in the sunlight. Then it rolled inverted and began its terminal plunge toward the gray North Sea below. Johnson had scored his inaugural victory. More importantly, he had demonstrated a crucial principle. The Thunderbolt's apparent weaknesses could become lethal strengths in skilled hands. Reports of Johnson's triumph spread rapidly through fighter units stationed across England. The big American fighter was doing more than surviving encounters with veteran German pilots. It was systematically defeating them. Intelligence officers began studying gun camera footage from these early encounters. What they discovered changed everything. The destruction unleashed by the P-47's massed firepower exceeded anything previously documented in aerial warfare. Other fighters needed extended bursts to knock down enemy aircraft. The Thunderbolt could demolish targets with brief, focused attacks. The difference was staggering. German fighters caught by the full force of 850 caliber guns simply came apart. Wings tore away from fuselages in explosive separations. Engines burst into fragments under the hammering impacts. Fuel tanks ignited in consuming fires that devoured entire aircraft within heartbeats. The concentrated weight of fire created devastation that had to be seen to be believed. Major Glenn Duncan became one of the first pilots to grasp the Thunderbolt's true potential. This aggressive Texan commanded a squadron in the 353rd Fighter Group. Duncan possessed an innovative tactical mind. He understood that the aircraft's massive firepower opened possibilities beyond traditional air-to-air combat. The same weapons that shredded enemy fighters could devastate ground targets with equal effectiveness. In March 1944, Duncan persuaded his commanding officers to authorize radical experiments. He wanted to test the P-47 as a dedicated ground attack platform. The concept challenged conventional thinking about fighter employment. Fighters were supposed to fight other fighters. Ground attack was the job of specialized aircraft. Duncan believed the Thunderbolt could excel at both missions simultaneously. The experimental results shattered everyone's expectations. Those 8 machine guns proved devastatingly effective against surface targets. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate tank plating. Incendiary rounds could ignite fuel depots in spectacular explosions. The sheer volume of fire could suppress enemy positions and destroy equipment that other aircraft could only damage. The psychological impact on enemy troops was equally significant. Duncan refused to stop with machine guns alone. He began testing external bomb loads on the rugged airframe. The Thunderbolt's robust construction could handle ordnance that would overwhelm lighter fighters. A fully loaded P-47 could carry 2,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. It retained its complete armament of 8 machine guns throughout the mission. Additionally, it could mount 10 5-inch rockets beneath its wings. This configuration provided firepower equivalent to an entire battery of field artillery. The transformation of the Thunderbolt from pure interceptor to multi-role fighter-bomber occurred at a critical juncture. By late 1943, Allied commanders were planning the invasion of Europe. They desperately needed aircraft capable of providing effective close-air support for advancing ground forces. Traditional heavy bombers proved too vulnerable operating at low altitudes over active battlefields. Pure fighters lacked sufficient firepower to destroy hardened defensive positions. The P-47 offered the perfect synthesis of firepower, protection, and survivability. The aircraft's radial engine configuration proved especially valuable in this demanding new role. Unlike the liquid-cooled power plants used in most contemporary fighters, the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp could continue operating despite significant battle damage. There were no vulnerable coolant lines to sever. Individual cylinders could be destroyed without stopping the entire engine. This extraordinary resilience allowed Thunderbolt pilots to press home attacks against heavily defended targets while still returning safely to base. Lieutenant Edwin Cottrell of the 493rd Fighter Squadron experienced this legendary durability during a harrowing mission over Belgium in December 1944. His P-47, affectionately nicknamed Arm Mary, had just completed a precision bombing attack against German armored formations. The mission had gone perfectly until enemy fighters intercepted his flight during the withdrawal. In the violent aerial combat that followed, Cottrell's aircraft absorbed multiple hits from 20mm cannon shells. Any liquid-cooled fighter would have been immediately crippled. The Thunderbolt's radial engine continued running despite visible damage to several cylinder heads. As Cottrell fought to control his badly damaged aircraft, something remarkable occurred. Two German pilots apparently recognized that the American was already critically wounded. Instead of delivering the killing blow, they made an extraordinary decision. They formed up on either side of the limping Thunderbolt and provided escort toward Allied territory. This spontaneous act of chivalry in the midst of ruthless warfare illustrated several important points. German pilots had developed genuine respect for the Thunderbolt's capabilities. They recognized the aircraft's reputation for bringing pilots home alive. Even enemies acknowledged that the massive American fighter was nearly impossible to destroy completely. Respect from adversaries offered little comfort to German ground forces. They faced the full fury of the Thunderbolt's evolved ground attack capabilities as 1944 progressed. The aircraft, initially dismissed as too heavy and ungainly for effective air combat, had transformed into the most feared close support platform in the entire Allied arsenal. Its reputation preceded it across every battlefield in Europe. This transformation reached its absolute peak during intensive preparations for D-Day. Allied air commanders had learned painful lessons about air superiority. Controlling the skies above the battlefield was insufficient for victory. They needed to systematically destroy the German army's ability to maneuver and fight on the ground level. The P-47 proved ideally suited for this expanded mission. It combined the necessary speed and agility to avoid concentrated enemy defenses with the overwhelming firepower required to eliminate hardened targets. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces launched their assault on the Normandy beaches, hundreds of Thunderbolts patrolled the skies over German-occupied France. Their primary mission was preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. They pursued this objective with devastating systematic effectiveness. Every vehicle moving on French roads became a legitimate target for the 8 machine guns and bomb loads carried by the prowling Thunderbolts. The psychological warfare aspect proved equally important as the physical destruction. The distinctive rumble of the Double Wasp engine became synonymous with sudden, devastating attacks that materialized without warning. German troops learned to scatter immediately at the first sound of approaching aircraft engines. They abandoned vehicles and equipment to seek whatever inadequate cover the terrain provided. The sight of P-47 silhouettes against the sky triggered instant panic among enemy formations. Major John Watersbecker discovered the true extent of Thunderbolt interdiction capabilities while leading a four-ship flight during the Battle of the Bulge. Flying reconnaissance along the winding Prüm River on the morning of December 17, 1944, he spotted what initially appeared to be a routine German supply convoy. The vehicles moved along a snow-covered road through the Ardennes forest. As Watersbecker descended for closer examination, he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. An entire German armored division was moving in broad daylight. They apparently believed that winter weather conditions would protect them from Allied air attacks. This represented exactly the type of target the Thunderbolts had been specifically designed to eliminate. Watersbecker's urgent attack call brought dozens of additional P-47s converging on the trapped German column. For the next several hours, successive waves of Thunderbolts hammered the helpless vehicles with bombs, rockets, and continuous machine gun fire. By evening, the narrow road was littered with destroyed tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Smoke columns rose from burning vehicles stretched across miles of countryside. An entire division had been rendered completely combat ineffective through air attack alone. The effectiveness of these systematic attacks extended far beyond immediate physical destruction. German commanders found it increasingly impossible to move large formations during daylight hours. They were forced to rely entirely on night movement, which severely reduced their operational flexibility and response time. Supply convoys became hazardous ventures requiring massive fighter escorts that often failed to reach their intended destinations. The German Army's legendary mobility, which had been their greatest tactical asset during the early war years, was being methodically destroyed by aircraft like the Thunderbolt. The most dramatic demonstration of P-47 capabilities occurred during Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead in July 1944. As American ground forces prepared to punch through entrenched German defensive lines, hundreds of Thunderbolts received assignments to clear the advance route by destroying enemy strongpoints and disrupting communication networks. This represented the largest concentration of close air support ever attempted in military history. The massive attack commenced at dawn on July 25th. Successive waves of P-47s dove on German positions that had successfully held up the Allied advance for weeks. The concentrated firepower of 8 machine guns per aircraft, multiplied by hundreds of attacking fighters, created an unprecedented storm of destruction. Everything in the target zone was obliterated by the sustained assault. German bunkers that had withstood prolonged artillery bombardments simply disintegrated under the impact of thousands of .50 caliber rounds striking simultaneously. When the air attack finally ended and American ground forces advanced, they encountered a landscape completely transformed by the Thunderbolt assault. German defensive positions had been reduced to smoking craters filled with twisted metal. Equipment lay scattered and destroyed across the entire battlefield. Communication lines had been severed. Command posts had been eliminated. Surviving German soldiers later described the experience as unlike anything they had endured throughout the war. Even veterans of the brutal Eastern Front, where they had faced the massed artillery of the Red Army, admitted they had never witnessed such concentrated destruction delivered from the air. The overwhelming success of Operation Cobra marked a fundamental turning point in military thinking about air power's role in ground warfare. Previously, air support had been viewed as supplementary to traditional artillery and infantry attacks. The Thunderbolts demonstrated conclusively that properly armed and tactically employed aircraft could serve as the primary assault weapon. They could destroy enemy forces completely before ground troops even made physical contact with defensive positions. This revolutionary transformation in combined arms tactics was made possible by the unique design characteristics of the P-47. Its 8 machine guns provided firepower density that no other single-engine aircraft could equal. Its exceptionally rugged construction allowed sustained operations at low altitudes, where accuracy was highest, but risks were most extreme. Its powerful engine provided the necessary speed to survive in heavily defended airspace while carrying substantial external bomb loads. The psychological impact on remaining Luftwaffe pilots proved equally significant to the physical destruction. German fighter units that had once confidently engaged Allied formations now found themselves completely outgunned and outmatched by aircraft that seemed virtually indestructible. The sight of incoming Thunderbolts, their wing-mounted guns flickering with muzzle flashes as they opened fire, became an immediate signal for desperate evasive action. Survival took precedence over offensive action. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Behr's professional assessment that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of battle damage and had to be handled with extreme caution reflected growing recognition among German pilots. This was not merely another enemy fighter to be engaged on equal terms. It was a flying fortress armed with unprecedented firepower and protected by armor and structural redundancy that made it extraordinarily difficult to destroy completely. The devastating effectiveness of the Thunderbolt's armament was enhanced through careful attention to ammunition selection and gun harmonization procedures. Each of the 8 machine guns was loaded with a precisely calculated mixture of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. This combination maximized effectiveness against different categories of targets encountered in combat. The guns were harmonized to converge their individual fire streams at specific predetermined ranges. This created a concentrated beaten zone where the full destructive weight of 8 guns could be focused on a single target point. Experienced pilots learned to exploit this firepower concentration by closing to optimal engagement range before opening fire. A 2-second burst from all 8 guns simultaneously could deliver over 100 rounds to the target area. This was sufficient ammunition to destroy any aircraft or disable most ground targets completely. The capability allowed Thunderbolt pilots to engage multiple targets during a single attack pass while maximizing their effectiveness and minimizing exposure to return fire from defensive positions. The aircraft's substantial ammunition capacity of 3,400 rounds meant pilots could engage numerous targets without concern for conservation. Unlike fighters armed with cannons which carried relatively few rounds per gun, the Thunderbolt could sustain extended combat engagements or attack multiple targets during a single mission sortie. This capability proved especially valuable during ground attack missions where pilots frequently encountered numerous targets of opportunity that required immediate engagement. By the time Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had compiled one of the most impressive combat records in aviation history. Thunderbolt pilots claimed over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. More than half of these victories occurred during traditional fighter versus fighter engagements. However, their impact on ground operations proved even more strategically significant than their air-to-air success. Thunderbolt squadrons destroyed over 86,000 railroad cars throughout the European theater. They eliminated 9,000 locomotives that were vital to German logistics networks. They knocked out 6,000 armored vehicles, including tanks and self-propelled guns. They destroyed 68,000 trucks that formed the backbone of German supply systems. These impressive statistics tell only part of the complete story. The real measure of Thunderbolt's success lay in its revolutionary ability to transform the fundamental nature of aerial warfare. Before the P-47 entered service, fighters were primarily designed to shoot down other aircraft in air-to-air combat. The Thunderbolt proved conclusively that a properly designed fighter could dominate both air and ground battlefields simultaneously. It provided close air support that equaled traditional artillery in destructive effectiveness, while maintaining superior tactical flexibility and response time. The aircraft's exceptional survival rate established completely new standards for pilot safety in combat operations. Of the more than 15,000 Thunderbolts manufactured during the war, only 3,499 were lost to all causes in combat zones. This represented an extraordinarily low loss rate of just 0.07% per mission flown. This figure compared very favorably with other Allied fighters operating in similar high-risk roles throughout the conflict. This remarkable survivability stemmed directly from the aircraft's fundamental design philosophy. Where other fighters prioritized pure performance over pilot protection, the Thunderbolt was engineered to absorb substantial battle damage and continue fighting effectively. Its radial engine could continue operating with multiple cylinder failures that would stop liquid-cooled engines immediately. Its thick wing structures contained self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive direct hits from enemy gunfire. Its robust airframe could withstand battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft completely. Lieutenant Edwin Wright of the 404th Fighter Group perfectly exemplified this legendary durability throughout his combat tour. He completed 39 combat missions despite being hit by anti-aircraft fire on 6 separate occasions. On one particularly memorable mission, an 8-inch hole was blown completely through his propeller by enemy gunfire. Yet his aircraft continued flying normally and brought him safely back to base for emergency landing. Wright's experience, repeated thousands of times throughout the war by other Thunderbolt pilots, demonstrated that the aircraft's designers had successfully achieved their primary goal of creating a fighter that could protect its pilot while delivering devastating offensive firepower. The enduring legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt extends far beyond its impressive statistical combat record. It established fundamental principles of fighter aircraft design that continue influencing military aviation development today. The revolutionary concept of trading pure aerodynamic agility for concentrated firepower and structural survivability became a cornerstone of American fighter design philosophy. The successful integration of air-to-air and air-to-ground combat capabilities in a single versatile platform pioneered the modern multi-role fighter concept that dominates contemporary air forces. Perhaps most importantly, the Thunderbolt demonstrated that innovative technological solutions could overcome apparent design disadvantages through clever engineering and tactical employment. Characteristics that initially seemed like fatal flaws, excessive weight, large physical size, complex mechanical systems, became decisive tactical advantages when properly exploited by skilled pilots and maintenance crews. The aircraft that German pilots initially dismissed as a lumbering flying bathtub evolved into the weapon that helped break the operational backbone of the Luftwaffe and paved the strategic way for complete Allied victory in Europe. The 850 caliber machine guns that defined the Thunderbolt's aggressive character represented far more than concentrated firepower alone. They symbolized American industrial might, engineering innovation, and tactical flexibility in the face of determined opposition. When those guns opened fire in unison, they announced that the age of Allied air supremacy had finally arrived over European battlefields. No target, whether airborne or ground-based, remained safe from their devastating combined effect. The sound of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously became synonymous with inevitable destruction and tactical dominance. Today, as we remember, the courageous pilots who flew these magnificent machines, and the dedicated ground crews who maintained them under difficult conditions, we can appreciate the P-47 Thunderbolt as much more than just another fighter aircraft in aviation history. It was an instrument of liberation, flown by brave men who used its extraordinary capabilities to restore freedom to an entire continent held under siege by totalitarian forces. The distinctive sound of 850 caliber machine guns blazing in perfect unison became the sound of hope returning to war-torn skies over Europe. It carried the promise that tyranny would not ultimately prevail against the combined forces of freedom and justice. The thunder of those guns echoed across battlefields as a declaration that liberty would triumph over oppression. In the final analysis, the Luftwaffe pilots who initially laughed at the ungainly P-47 Thunderbolt learned to respect and fear it above all other Allied fighters they encountered. They discovered through bitter experience that its 8 machine guns could indeed shred their formations with devastating effectiveness. The big American fighter combined overwhelming firepower with nearly indestructible structural durability. The aircraft they had dismissed as too heavy and clumsy to be operationally effective became the primary weapon that helped drive them from European skies and sealed the ultimate fate of the Third Reich. The Thunderbolt had proven beyond doubt that sometimes bigger really is significantly better, especially when bigger means 850 caliber machine guns and the courage to use them decisively.